Bibliophiles of the internet, my name's Adriana, and today I'm here to wish you all a happy 2020 and bring you my December wrap-up. Couple of housekeeping things. First, I'm going to be pretty busy in the upcoming week, so there may be a slight delay between now and my best of 2019 video, but just be patient with me. It does take some time to write and organize, and obviously I want to share that with you when I can. Secondly, I did read 8 things for the Queer Lit Readathon during the first week of December, and I've already reviewed those books in my Queer Lit wrap-up. There you can find my thoughts on Reverie, Poems I Sleep Next To, Crier's War, Our Dreams at Dusk, Mangoes and Mistletoe, Sorted, and the Avant-Guards, so be sure to check that out. This video will cover everything else I read for the rest of December, so let's start talking about these books. First, I read my arc of The Queen's Assassin by Melissa de la Cruz. This comes out on February 4th. It's a YA fantasy romance about a royal assassin named Kaladin whose father made an oath to the queen that he would restore these lost ancient scrolls of knowledge to the kingdom, or else his oath would be passed through his bloodline until that comes to pass. And there's also a young girl named Shadow who is summoned to serve in the royal court, but she is determined to instead become an assassin, so she goes to break Cal out of prison to prove that she is worthy of becoming his apprentice. I'm gonna be honest, this story does not have the best world building. There were these sections with lofty backstories about dead kings and warring kingdoms and lost magic that didn't make much sense. But I wanted to read this one because it's a fantasy romance, and I was not disappointed by the romance. I think the relationship between Cal and Shadow is the anchor in this story, and I really love the parallels between them since they're both tied to these unsatisfying fates, and they're both trying to find a way to live by their own desires and standards. They definitely have conflicting personalities and butt heads, but they also both have something to teach the other person, whether it's combat or how to navigate high society and royal courts, and I really enjoy that kind of exchange. There's a lot of court intrigue in this story specifically, and you get to see Cal and Shadow doing everything from breaking out of prison to masquerading as nobles to dealing with the fact that, oh no, there's only one bed, and I quite enjoyed those components. I was pretty annoyed with how Shadow disguises herself as a boy in the beginning by badly chopping off her hair and wrapping some cloth around her chest and then successfully passing as male, which any trans person would tell you is total BS. And like I said, I could not tell you what distinguishes one kingdom from another, why they're fighting, or even how the events of this story got Cal and Shadow closer to their goal of obtaining the scrolls, but it's still fun, the main relationship is dynamic, and it has an enjoyable romance. So I did really enjoy the time I spent with this story, even though it's definitely not perfect, and I gave it 3.5 stars. Then I finally listened to The Queen of Nothing by Holly Black, read by Caitlin Kelly. I can't say much about this since it's the finale to The Cruel Prince, but generally speaking, the series is about Jude, whose parents are killed by a fairy, and then she and her sisters are taken to live in the fairy world where it's very hard for them to fend for themselves. And the series follows Jude on her endless quest to obtain power over this world that has proven to be both wondrous and dangerous. Content warnings for murder, death, war-related crimes, and genre-related violence. I know this is a polarizing series, but I've always connected with it because it's about Jude trying to wring blood from a stone, constantly fighting to make this world acknowledge her and love her back when it simply was not built for her in the first place. To see her ambition grow in ways that are both healthy and unhealthy, to see her unwavering determination to dominate those who have wronged her at any cost, has always been such an intoxicating and compelling part of this series. Jude is reckless and she's willing to gamble high for an impossible payoff, and I kind of respect her for that. And her relationship with Cardin both compels and repels me. They're definitely not perfect and they both have a laundry list of faults and flaws, but they are still equals in every sense. Throughout the series, they have definitely treated each other with disdain and even hatred, but they have always seen and understood each other's strengths and planned their actions accordingly in response. And I think that's what they both want the most, to be acknowledged and respected for their capabilities, even though they both need to work on breaking those walls down and making themselves vulnerable, which you definitely see in this installment. Even though I wish it was a little bit longer and the climactic action drawn out a little bit more, I still had such a visceral and physical reaction to this book, and I gave it 4.5 stars. Then I listened to A Boy Called Christmas by Matt Haig, read by Stephen Fry. This is a middle grade fantasy adventure story that's a surprisingly refreshing take on the origins of Santa Claus. The main character, Nicholas, lives alone with his father in relative poverty because his mother passed away, so his father embarks on this bounty mission that pays really well, but then he never comes back. So Nicholas ventures out to the North Pole on a journey to find him and save him no matter what it takes. And, you know, as one does, just becomes a legend in the process. Content warnings for mentions and exploration of parental death, feelings of loss, and some graphic humor and moments. This story is surprisingly dark and confronts a lot of difficult topics like loss, death, and poverty, but it still manages to be hopeful and adventurous. That's what really struck me about this particular reimagining, that it's about living with that sadness and pain in your heart and how you don't have to negate those feelings to experience happiness. This take on the Santa Claus myth is all about intention and hope, and how these little things we consider to be essential to Father Christmas are really about the things Nicholas wants to keep alive as traditions. You see how the red hat is a nod to his father, the trademark laugh and mirth a nod to his mother, and it's about how we keep those we love close by imbuing those small actions with purpose. Matt Haig brilliantly balances lightness and darkness. This story is not without sorrow, loss, or hardship, but instead it's about Nicholas using those things as a reminder of why he wants to nurture hope and joyfulness where it does not yet exist. It's a really wonderful, thoughtful, enjoyable story about turning towards generosity and love in the presence of darkness, and while I do think it followed Nicholas a little too far into the future, I loved it so much and I gave it 4.5 stars. Then I read my arc of Spellhacker by M.K. England. This comes out on January 21st. It's an own voices queer YA blend of sci-fi and fantasy about this world where magic, known as Maz, is heavily regulated by the government after an earthquake unleashed a spell plague that infected countless citizens. Our main character Diz works with a small crew to illegally siphon Maz for a price. Just before the group is planning on parting ways, they accept one last job that leads them to discover a new strain of Maz, and now they find themselves on the run as they try to expose the connection between this new strain and the devastating illness. Content warnings for explorations of grief and loss, and in-depth explorations of symptoms and treatments relating to autoimmune disorders. I also want to mention that the main love interest is non-binary, which is Own Voices rep, and they also have this autoimmune disorder, so there's also some representation for chronic illness. Obviously, M.K. England has found their niche with stories about a band of misfits who accidentally uncover corruption and have to save the world, but it's freaking fantastic, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I love this story because it's about found family, yes, but also about how found families are not inherently perfect just because they're made by choice. This group is actually fairly contentious for most of the story because half of them want to skip town and Diz wants to stay, but none of them really want to be apart from each other, but none of them are willing to actually admit that. And Diz is kind of hoping that this one last job is going to remind them about why they make such a good team in the first place. Diz is very much dealing with this internal conflict of wanting to feel needed and valued, but also not being willing to vocalize those things. And she can definitely be petty and messy and make rash decisions that push her friends away in the process because she thinks it's easier to create a rift than to actually acknowledge her emotions. So I appreciate that while there's a lot of really cool magic and tech, and this is a really fast-paced story about governmental corruption and a heist gone horribly wrong, it's really an emotional journey that Diz and her teammates have to undertake. And as always, M.K. England has killer one-liners and banter and great narration, and I just really enjoy the marriage of those things with an exciting and meaningful concept. I do think there were some small moments of convenience and that it wrapped up fairly quickly for my taste, but I still love it and I definitely recommend it right alongside The Disasters, and I gave this one 4 stars. After that, my lovely patrons voted for me to read my arc of The Gravity of Us by Phil Stamper. This comes out on February 4th. It's an Own Voices queer YA contemporary story about Cal, an aspiring journalist and social media star whose life is turned upside down when his father is accepted to become an astronaut on a groundbreaking mission to Mars. The entire family moves from New York to Texas, where they are thrust into this bizarre reality show about the families of the astronauts. But it's there that Cal meets and falls for a fellow astro kid named Leon and realizes that he can use his social media presence and his voice to shed light on the real stories NASA is not showing in their scripted content. Content warnings for brief descriptions of depression, anxiety, and general symptoms relating to mental health issues. This was such a pleasant surprise. It's one of the most hopeful and empowering YA stories I've read in 2019. As a protagonist, Cal is dealing with some indisputably powerful forces, the pressures of a social media following, the collective power of NASA, and not to mention this hellish reality show that spins these families' lives for the cameras. When his family moves, Cal is faced with the real possibility of having to walk away from his life as an online reporter because of the confidentiality and because of the sole rights this show has to any recorded media regarding the astronauts. but he will not be stopped. In that way, the story takes all the pressure, hopelessness, and cynicism that real teens face on a daily basis and makes them into a literal force that Cal faces down, opting to seize control of the situation with whatever power and agency he still has. The story is earnest and romantic and dramatic, but in the end, it's about the importance of spotlighting and celebrating hope and truth instead of surrendering to the idea that there is none left. Cal is also confronting his tendency to be chronically productive and how he always wants to be fixing things in his life, but he's learning that people and relationships are not something to be fixed, but things that can be bettered and bolstered with empathy, kindness, and patience. While there were some storylines and beats I wanted to see more of, like the tension between Cal and the best friend he left behind in New York, overall I found this story to be invigorating and extremely satisfying. I'm really stoked about this book's release and I gave it 4.5 stars. Then I finally read Volume 4 of Our Dreams at Dusk by Kamatani Yuhki. This is the final volume in this Own Voices queer slice of life series about a closeted high school boy named Dazuku who once considered taking his own life, but now volunteers at this local drop-in center for queer folks where they rebuild and repurpose abandoned houses. And there he's exposed to all these queer experiences that are different from his, and as he learns how to address his own misconceptions and internalized homophobia, he's figuring out his place in this world and how he can help people going through similar experiences. Overall, definite content warnings for suicide ideation, bullying, homophobia, transphobia, homophobic and transphobic slurs, and non-violent hate crimes. Even though I just named off a ton of heavy content warnings, and even though this story very necessarily addresses the real hardships that queer people face, especially in societies that lack acceptance, this is an incredibly uplifting, powerful, and affirming series. And it is so rare, especially in the realm of manga, for something like this to even exist. I've never seen another manga created by an openly non-binary mangaka that uses words like non-binary, asexual, or aromantic on the page, and there were times I had to stop myself just because of how much it meant to see those words. And I've always said I appreciate how this manga confronts hard realities that queer people face, but then also shows characters who are trying to work through those hardships with empathy and grace. In this volume specifically, there was a scene where someone tagged the house with homophobic threats, and instead of folding under the sadness of that, one of the volunteers just started washing up and said, "You know, a few years ago, I might have been the one who wrote this." And that hit so hard because part of accepting your queer existence is working through all the internalized self-hatred and homophobia that each and every one of us is directly or indirectly taught. And obviously there are ways to work through that are appropriate and inappropriate, and you definitely see a little bit of both in this series. That moment seemed to say to me that we can't reach everyone who's broken and misguided, but we can stand up to each other and for each other and show up when it counts. I will never be able to say what this series has meant to me, but I can say that I gave this final volume 5 stars. Then I read my arc of Only Mostly Devastated by Sophie Gonzales. This comes out on March 3rd. It's a queer YA reimagining of Greece in a modern day setting. It's about high school senior Ollie who has a whirlwind summer romance with this amazing guy named Will, and instead of going back to California as they thought, Ollie's family ends up staying on to help Ollie's aunt as they deal with her cancer diagnosis. When Ollie finds out he and Will now go to the same high school, he kind of expects them to pick up where they left off, but Will is definitely playing the part of the insensitive jock to overcompensate for the fact that he is still very much in the closet. Content warnings for descriptions of terminal illness, exploration of familial death and loss, possibly depressive thoughts concerning death, mild homophobia, and brief usage of sexual slurs. What I appreciate is how the story strives to amend what the original Grease fails to show, owning up to bad behavior, what it means to accept that bad behavior, how human decency should take precedence over fear, and how we don't have to compromise ourselves for anyone else's sake. Ollie is well aware of how badly Will is treating him in public, and even though he wants to accept whatever tiny modicums of attention the other boy is willing to give, he eventually comes to realize that his dignity and self-worth are far more important. And I really love that the story acknowledges that, but it's still hard because Ollie and Will are still having these romantic moments and building a romantic relationship while Ollie is getting mistreated, and that's still hard to read about and witness. It's just hard for me because Will isn't always great, and he does a lot of not great stuff, and while I recognize that he's on a journey to self-growth, it's hard for me to reconcile that with him ultimately being positioned as the romantic hero in this book. I'm genuinely torn because it's good to have a story that acknowledges that life is not perfect, it's not always fair or makes sense, and relationships are not perfect, and that it's important to work through conflict, but I also don't feel like it's Ollie's responsibility to teach Will self-acceptance at great emotional cost. I also had some structural issues with the story because it's trying to balance this romantic dramedy with this narrative about cancer and loss. And while it's absolutely possible to cohesively balance self-discovery, romance, and grief in one story, I felt like those elements would only fade in and out as necessary, and when one of them took the forefront, the others completely fell out of focus. And I also think the narration does that thing where it overcompensates for quirkiness and sassiness at the expense of bordering insensitivity and offensiveness. There were times where you could tell the narrative voice was trying to be colorful and personable, but for me it just felt a bit hollow and fell short. So I'm definitely conflicted. I liked it, I see the importance of it, but I didn't love it, so I gave it 3 stars. And finally I was like, I cannot end this decade with a 3-star book, so I picked up what I knew was a surefire success and listened to This Is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El-Mohtar and Max Gladstone, read by Cynthia Farrell and Emily Wu Zeller. This is top-notch queer SFF about these secret agents on different sides of the Time War who unexpectedly begin a very fraught correspondence. What starts off as a taunt or a setup quickly evolves into something deeply emotional and romantic and puts both agents at risk to be discovered as traitors within their factions. When I finished this book, all I could do was sit there and stare off into space, and the only words that came out of my mouth for like 10 minutes were quiet expletives because this book is as damn near poetry as prose can get without being constructed in actual verses. I have not been this affected by language since the Song of Achilles. The evolution of these characters, the scope of this story is overwhelming. It begins so simply with these 2 opposing agents mocking and baiting each other, but you see that evolve into begrudging affection and respect for their counterparts. In this line of work especially, they're meant to be a cog in the machine, an indistinguishable shadow that leaves behind no trace. Their personhood is not acknowledged or celebrated, and through these letters they're able to both see the other person and truly expose the very core of themselves. And I love that their letters are not simply text-based. They have really creative ways of exchanging correspondence, whether it's in tea leaves or tree rings or poisonous seeds, and that makes their relationship into an all-consuming, tangible, organic experience. Their relationship is something they can experience tangibly in the world. It's something that literally sustains them and exists within and without all at once. It's this story about the little rebellions that we take up on a daily basis. It's about working around impossible limits and outsmarting a system based on opposition and greed by thinking to love, not only others, but ourselves. It's about how we build pieces of ourselves into each other every single time we connect, and what a tremendous feat it is to reach out in the first place. I don't have the words for what this book made me feel, but it was very decisively a 5-star book. So there you have it. Those are all the books I read in the month of December. As always, if you've read any of these yourself and would like to discuss, meet me in the comments below or let me know what was the first book that you read to kick off 2020. But that's everything I have for this wrap up today. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope that you enjoyed it, and I'll catch you on the flip side of the page.